Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 85th edition of the Frankenstein Chat. And I'm delighted to say we have Adrian Gray with us, a colleague I know very well from my time with Ofsted, because Adrian was a senior manager there. Hello, Adrian. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Frank. Nice to see you again. You look
Yeah.
not a day older.
Yeah.
You looked that old before.
Where are you based at the moment, and what are you doing with your life?
Well, the way my daughter describes where we live is she says the postcode's Yorkshire, the county is Nottinghamshire, and the nearest place is Lincoln. So, i.e. in the middle of nowhere. For those who know the area, if you know where the toll bridge is across the River Trent, that's more or less where we live.
I know
and I'm an independent consultant. I work with various local authorities, academy trusts. And next week I'm doing a European seminar, which is going to be good fun.
And that European seminar is is that about inspection?
It's about school inspection and how concepts of excellence have changed over the centuries, because school inspection is over 200 years old.
Yeah.
People know that.
No, well, see, when we worked together, Adrian was the one that was always sort of meeting up with various sort of international inspectorates and things like that, weren't you, Adrian? It was something that you were the go-to person in that area.
Yeah, that was a nice bit of the job, Frank. we won't tell them about the other bit.
In the school I was head in the logbook, the school was docked money for embroidery because of an inspection in about 120 years ago.
That's right. That's the sort of thing that they did in those days.
Okay, well, hello, Stan. How are you?
I'm okay. It's an evening, so I don't know if the lighting's different or whatever. So
it feels very odd doing it in the evening.
It feels odd doing it on an evening, but yeah, that's my fault. So
and I think also you've had a bit of a tough week. I don't want to go into details with it, but there's been a bit of a tough week at home. And
yeah, we're not had a good week, but we'll get above it and beyond it. So we'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what the first issue that we cover, and one that the only bit that we actually sort of think about in advance, is what's caught your eye this week. So we'll go to you, Stan. What's caught your eye this week?
Well, it's a very topical one because it's only happened yesterday and today. Ofsted issued some guidance yesterday for childminders and people who did childcare, registered people. It was all about reporting anybody who worked with you in terms of volunteers or staff, any change in their medical history, any change in the building. And it was farcical, really, once you started to analyse it. But today it's been withdrawn. And my thought is, who checked it? Who looked at it and said, yeah, that's okay to put out? Because it clearly wasn't. I think it breached quite a number of regulations asking for information about volunteers who work with you to give their medical details to an inspector. Well,
perhaps the people who were meant to check it had been invited to a garden party.
Or perhaps it was written as a work activity at the end of the day.
After the party, yeah.
Yeah, I do have some sympathy for those people that work in the centre for Ofsted. I mean, sometimes you think that these things, there's loads of time to prepare and to work through, but sometimes these sort of things just appear in an email at 9 o'clock in the morning, and suddenly a response has got to be made by, well, probably 12 o'clock midday, and sometimes this is driven by, a very senior manager wanting has been asked to do something and agrees to it, and then suddenly you're head down trying to come up with some guidance. But
Frank, I could ask 3 people that I know to look at something like that, and 2 out of the 3 of them would have said, you need to look at it again.
Yeah. Well, they always say, don't they? Don't do these sorts of things in haste. Obviously, somebody has there. So, or perhaps somebody pressed the wrong button. I don't know what the.
It had the full.
Right.
The full launch.
Really, there's no defence, Stan. I mean, there was.
Not at all, in my view.
Yeah. Well,
even though they've withdrawn it, to be honest, Frank, there's a lot of people who were very anxious yesterday and very angry at some more work they would have had to have done on top of everything. So I doubt anybody actually did anything, but we don't need much at the moment, do we, to
No.
add to people's stress?
Yeah. Adrian, what's caught your eye then this week?
Well, I haven't spent so much time on the media because I actually try to go to schools occasionally and talk to real
Touche.
people. Nice. And, it was terrible. I mean, this is going to sound awful for some people, but it was terrible during COVID being a consultant because you never actually got to talk to a real person. And I'm not sure if I've recovered my sanity or not from that. But I have been, over the last week or two, been to some small schools, and I love going to small schools. And small village primary schools have become quite an obsession for me. And actually, it began with one of the pieces of work. One of the first pieces of work I did as a consultant was I was commissioned by an LA to look at their small schools issue. And their small schools were between 24 and 100 pupils, which is tiny compared to some people. And actually, I think it was the best piece of work I've ever done in terms of enjoyment. I can remember sitting in my car in some remote country area thinking, I'm being paid to do this piece of work. It's great fun. But it did produce, it made me think about some of the issues. Some of the financial issues. I remember saying to one chair of governors whose school had 26 pupils, well, you can either have a school or you can have your own head teacher, but you cannot have both. And he was very reluctant to accept that. And I remember going to another school where I was asked the head about, what they think the main problems of being in a small school are. And she said, when I came to this school, there were two other teachers and they hadn't spoken to each other for 2.5 years. So they'd had a fallout. But those are the little human things which make working schools fun, to be honest. But the challenges for small schools are very great. So I've been working on some guidance on partnerships, trying to set up some partnerships between relatively small schools, and also some guidance for small church schools. And one of the things we found was that a lot of schools didn't really understand their options in terms of academisation if they were church schools. So that was very interesting. But of course, the big issue that challenges them all, I think, is the disproportionate impact for them of the Ofsted framework. Now, I don't know whether inspectors are more understanding in the context of small schools or not, but certainly when you've got responsibility for 4 subjects, that's quite a lot of extra pressure on people in the framework compared to someone in a school who's only got 1 subject. So, my heart goes out to those folks, and anything we can do to support them would seem to be great.
Yeah, it's interesting because Stan, the first time we met when we were doing inspections together in the mid-90s, we basically concentrated for much of that year on small schools in the northwest, didn't we? We were doing lots of. I mean, I remember the first school I inspected, which was Great Salkeld Primary School. That had 2 classes, 1.5 really. I think it had half a class in the morning when the supply teacher was there, when the part-time teacher was there, and then they all went into a class with about 35 children in it across 7 age groups with the head teacher teaching them, and actually I'd never come across anything like it before. I found myself thinking very carefully about, I felt uncomfortable because I just wasn't able to relate closely enough with it.
I don't know if you remember, Frank, but whether we did it together or whether I did it with somebody else, but there was one school that had 2.5 teachers, and it was going to have to lose half a teacher because the budget wouldn't stretch to it. And I knew that the cost of the inspection had been greater than the cost of keeping that teacher on. And I remember sitting, what difference am I making to these children here that a half a teacher for a percentage of time wouldn't make better use of it? It's just strange. But they are, when I was an advisor, I had a couple of very small schools. And at the time, Ofsted were pushing the self-evaluation, lesson observation, bringing people to account. And I just had this vision of the head teacher sitting with a teacher, telling her a lesson was inadequate and she really wasn't up to it. She needed to improve. Oh, and by the way, can I have a lift home? Because that's the nature.
Or can I don't forget, I'm coming in to check on the quality of your teaching tomorrow for a subject that I'm responsible for.
I do. There are some benefits. I can remember doing an inspection of a tiny school in Cumbria, and it was the sort of school where they allocated you 2 days, and you thought these people are going to die if I spend 2 days in the school. So we agreed I'd do 2 half days, which meant that I could do my school inspection in the morning and then go up the mountains in the afternoon.
Oh dear. I mean, I think the issue though about, it's funny when I do presentations, these virtual presentations, and on side there's a little chat column, isn't there? And this week, a head teacher of a small school commented and basically brought the whole thing down to earth, really, because in a way, the whole thing, what we were talking about was very much based on structures. And actually, the point she was making, that there are only 3 of us, and there is no structure. So in effect, what she was saying was that, in the chat, that it's very difficult to relate to the points you're making. They're relevant, but the actual solutions or the way that you're talking about them, there's no relation to the experiences I have as a small school head, and actually sort of really sort of jolted me, because you're giving the presentation full flow and suddenly you can see on the right hand side somebody's taken the rug from under your feet completely.
Well, we had the case of one of my schools on target setting, and I sent the figures into the authority, and I got this steaming letter back saying that what were standards like in this school when they were setting 0 as a target. And I pointed out they didn't have any children in year 6 in that cohort. They wouldn't have any, but that wasn't deemed good enough. So I said, well, if you get a child, it'll go up to 100%. But at the moment, the target is 0. Well, the target wasn't ambitious enough. So we had to set a target that they would get a year 6 child.
Well, what's caught my eye this week is we've had some correspondence. So a colleague who has been a guest on the show before has emailed me, basically just wanting us to talk about what we feel is happening to previously outstanding schools that are now being re-inspected after a long period. And he has made the point that 84% of the previously outstanding schools that were inspected in September and October have been downgraded, and 47% of previously good schools were also downgraded. So he's sort of raising the point, well, where are we with graded inspections of schools when actually there's so much volatility and there's an unstable nature to them? Actually, is it time to call a halt to grading of institutions, grading of schools in the way that they are currently graded? So I thought that's probably quite a good point for you two to consider. I mean, Adrian, have you got a view?
Well, I mean, it just starts off the whole thing about you grade on what you look at and you don't grade on everything else. And I mean, half this problem about the curriculum is down to government emphasis and Ofsted emphasis. So, if we go back to the beginning of the national curriculum, the government decided that English, maths and science were the most important subjects and we'd have SATs in them. Then what happened? Somebody decided that science SATs were too much, so they cut it out. And then lo and behold, what happened? Schools downgraded the importance of science. Yeah. So they're not daft, are they? They do what people say to them is valuable. And I can remember, I'm not sure if this is when you were in charge, Frank, so it probably wasn't your fault. Steady. Who knows? When we were doing some analysis for the annual report a few years ago, we actually analysed what subjects inspectors went to see when they were in primary school. And it came out something like 86% English and maths. So, the obvious message was we were not inspecting the curriculum at all. We were just inspecting English, maths. And from what I remember, the main result of that was that inspectors were told to stop recording the subject of their observation. So often then didn't know what lessons were being. So that actually is a true story. So now we've got the situation where to me, schools were outstanding in the past on one framework, but now we're looking at things totally differently. And is that must be confusing for parents who then face a situation where they've got their school has gone from outstanding to good, and they haven't noticed any apparent change.
or Adrian, to be honest, you can get better and go down because it depends what's judged.
Yeah.
So
Exactly,
the school
yeah.
can actually be a much better school than it was, but be downgraded from outstanding to good.
No, I think, Adrian, you've done some. No, I'm sorry to cut you off there. Because I want to bring you into. You've done some interesting retrieval on deep dives, haven't you, in primary schools?
Well, yes, and I've had a few conversations about that since, because there are 10 or so subjects, aren't there? And most primary heads know full well that there may be 5 or 6 that they're pretty good on, but there are 4 that they're pretty bad on. And I often meet, in fact, I met one head teacher who also led on 4 subjects. And he admitted to me that he was pretty good at 2 of them and pretty rubbish at the other 2. And he was correct. So there's a lottery there now, where your deep dive makes a difference. But it seems to me that therefore there's a rather crucial conversation that takes place after the inspectors said they're doing reading and maths as to what gets picked next. And what difference does that make to the overall result?
Now, you found that actually the chances of you getting a deep dive in design technology were
pretty slim.
Minuscule.
Pretty slim.
And I would have thought inspectors' expertise in design technology was pretty slim as well.
Well, yes, and I mean that's an interesting topic in itself, Frank. But yes, what we noticed was there were a fair number of science deep dives, but then history was the one that kept coming up, and roughly half the deep dive schools have had a history one. So why is that? And I suspect that's because history is deemed as something that most schools are quite good at, and possibly most schools think that they're quite good at when they're not, and possibly inspectors who are non-expert think that they quite understand history as well.
And Adrian is a history expert.
Yeah,
Go on,
I'd agree with that. Well, because going back to many years ago when we inspected, I used to hear comments of inspectors about art that were just completely wrong. Oh, this is art's really good. Look at this piece, and I'd say that's just pastiche. That's just children copying somebody else's work. It's not art. Well, no, I think it's really good. I'm grading that very highly.
Yeah, and I like that chronology is not history.
Yeah.
As geography is not maps.
Yeah. Oh dear. But actually, where can we?
But just on that subject, then, because there's another nuance there, isn't there? The quality of the inspector and the inspector's knowledge of that subject will also have an impact on how it's regarded. Because I'm assuming, Adrian, if you went into somewhere and history was average, you would find some faults with it. If the average primary school history curriculum. Whereas if Joe Bloggs goes in, who knows nothing about history, but history is the thing he's looking at, that may come out very favourably.
Yes. Now, I do think it's right, because actually Ofsted had created this problem where the curriculum was declining in some areas. But are we doing it in the right way is a big challenge. And we really don't know whether the inspectors are expert enough in those subjects that they're talking about. I mean, I know a primary school where they were a deprived primary school where they were criticised because pupils couldn't name enough pre-1800 composers. And you just think, well, what makes that top of the list of things that they ought to know? it seems random. And when I read I mean, part of the trouble is the reports are so,
I know they're so thin.
you know, but if you read anything about history, it's about pupils can put key events in the right order, and that's just, you know, history by paint by numbers approach, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking at a complaint today. School, it's all gone through the complaint process. They just wanted me to have a look at it, and I was struck by the fact that a deep dive was in reading, early reading, and I'm thinking to myself, can you really do an inspection of a primary school without evaluating how effectively children are reading, whether they're early readers or mature readers?
Well, they do deep dives in reading in every school. Sometimes they call it early reading, and sometimes they call it reading.
But that cannot be right. We cannot have inspections going on where actually we're choosing to do an evaluation on something that is central to well, this is getting us onto the subject now, on what to me would be essentially an aspect of a good education. You know what I mean? It's not as if that is such a central element of it, that I think that the idea that you deep dive that, you surely should be deep diving that, if that's the term, that should be part of the core evaluation that you undertake.
Yeah. I mean, I think
not something gets special treatment.
In the numbers it is, but it's confusing that they then call it a deep dive.
Right.
You know, I think that's the problem, that the inspectors say they're doing a deep dive in reading, but actually they have to do reading.
So we were talking before, Adrian, that you know you've done work looking at other countries and what have you, and about. I mean, we talk a lot here, Stan and I, about what is a good education. But actually, the work you've been doing has been looking at that, but over a period of time, and how that has been, who's been deciding and determining what makes a good education.
Fascinating topic, Frank. Now, I mean, the two big questions for me that I've sort of looked at how school inspection evaluation has developed in Europe since the late 1700s, really, although you can go back even earlier than that if you're desperate. And you know, there are two questions which emerge from it, one of which is who decides what is excellence? And the second one is, well, what is excellence? Yeah. And it's a fascinating area to which I wouldn't say I've necessarily got the answers. But it's quite clear that what is excellence has changed a lot over time, although some things haven't in some countries. So you'll find, for example, some school inspection frameworks in Europe still include work on, you know, quality of buildings and sanitation and that sort of thing, which was there 200 years ago. Whereas other things have clearly changed over time, like safeguarding, for example, which nobody was interested in probably when I was at school. Most of my former teachers are in prison, which I'll talk about on another occasion, some of them anyway. And diversity and citizenship and things like that have come into the curriculum. And you know, looking at how things have changed over time, I was interested in well, who makes those decisions and what's the best process. So if you go back to the middle of the 1800s, for example, there was a time when the churches actually controlled inspection, and often in a very personal way. So, I mean, one of my favourite bits is that the Monsignor or the Cardinal or whoever was in charge of school inspection in Malta, he insisted one of the things that had to be checked in all schools was the posture of the teacher. So for those who like slouching around in the classroom, there's your risk go. But and then it became a battleground between the churches and governments. And then by the 1890s, you started to get teacher trade unions becoming more prominent, and people started to write books about school management. So you got all of that information coming in as well. But looking at the pattern over time, you see huge variations in who's making the decisions. So in the 1920s, the inspectors in Germany, for example, were seen as in cahoots with progressive educationalists, and parents organised strikes because they didn't agree with the teaching methods being pushed through by the inspectors. This is pre-Hitler, by the way. And then, of course, in other countries, inspection was determined very much by the government. And they were inspecting you according to whether you were reading the right books, you had the right politics, and all of that sort of thing, which was very common, of course, in Eastern Europe and actually parts of Western Europe. So it leads me to my dilemma really is, what's the correct balance of who decides what is excellent? We've heard about the blob, and the blob being taken on by the government, and we live in a democracy. But what's the boundary there? Because sometimes democratic governments might put in things which we as educationists think are a bit daft, for example.
But I think also, though, Adrian, I don't know if you were around at that time. I think you were, but also
I've been around a few years.
Chief inspectors, a chief inspector that I think we worked for, decided that litter, in the school was a major concern, or the dress, the attire, how presentable staff were. So I do remember that there were sort of short bursts of let's investigate litter, let's investigate the attire of inspectors. So in effect, those sort of controls were at that level were still controlled by the chief inspector. But I know, and you and I know, that oversight by the Department for Education on any framework is quite close, when you're developing a framework. So this idea, for those who've not been involved in this, is that it would be wrong to say that the Department for Education approved the framework, but actually the general thrust of the framework they need to be content with, I think, is probably the best way it was for me anyway. But actually it feels as though more recently the current framework is driven a little bit more by some ideology around, or some belief around, the importance of the curriculum as the central sort of thing that holds it all together, which I never felt, actually, in all of my previous time, we've ever been quite driven by that type of issue. I suppose, in a sense, we've always had leadership. Various chief inspectors have always focused in on leadership and management and the debate between the two.
Well, Frank, actually, I'll challenge you on that, because in our first framework that we used, leadership was only in one word, and it was to do with governance.
Right.
It was governors who did lead it. The head teacher was a manager. So,
yeah,
so
until the 1920s, it didn't feature at all, because most of the inspection was focused on inspecting the individual teacher, and the head teacher hardly came into it.
Yeah.
So,
my view is of that leadership jump was that they linked leadership with successful schools, and because the schools had been graded highly, they said, oh, the leadership must be good in that school. And then they flipped that over and said, so if leadership's good, the school must be good. And all that came from, I think, data that came from those early frameworks that didn't have a single bit of evidence about leadership other than the leadership of governors.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and there's a strand there which takes us from why are so many teaching schools in highly privileged areas,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've spoken a lot, though, about some. I don't know whether I don't know where we are on the spectrum of things with regard to what is a good education or what makes a good school. But I think that the discussions that you would promote, Stan, were around experience, breadth of experience, and having a meaningful sort of experience of schooling is a central part to what makes it good in that sense. So in effect, if you don't have that breadth of experience, then that's actually going to hinder your understanding of what life is.
It's always a hierarchy, isn't it? You can't, if you say, oh, I think, like I often do, experiences, and somebody comes back and said, yeah, but if they don't know that to read and write, well, I get that, but I think the way the curriculum is being judged at the moment, I don't think, and despite me writing to Ofsted a couple of times, I don't think the word experience is actually in there. So it doesn't ask how people experience that or what experiences the school have put in to supplement the curriculum or to build the curriculum. It's not something that's judged. And I always say, if you think back to your own schooling, you remember the experiences. Those are the things that stick.
Yeah. I mean,
maybe it'll be knowledge in future. Maybe we'll be able to rapidly fire off some knowledge that we learned from a knowledge organizer.
Oh no! Don't mention knowledge organisers.
It's the thing. If we're going to judge schools on a curriculum full of knowledge, then
it's very interesting though when you look at international. I mean, I've been looking at some. We've been doing some work with regard to some other sort of work I've been doing with employers. How do other countries tackle issues around learning? Education generally, and actually they view it. The most successful ones they do view it not in a narrow range. They don't view it as school and then post 16 and university. They see the whole thing as actually enabling a citizen to learn through their life. And so it's not compartmentalized. People at various stages in this route forward in their lives, and they will experience and meet challenges at different times. We seem to present the challenges to young people and to adults at set times, generally, So that, and it's really interesting when you see the way that this is articulated, so they don't fall into the FE, HE, post 16, A level, key stage 2, all these little compartments that we have in England or in the UK, that they're free of that, and actually it sort of makes their thinking about what education is about a much broader one that ventures into, well, are these skills and experience and knowledge going to be useful for them, not just in work, but in later life, whatever they do, a broader understanding about what the human citizen needs in order to be a successful person.
Well, I think your key word there, Frank, for me is understanding. Now, I mean, personally, I think there's actually quite a lot of good stuff in the Ofsted framework, and it is driving an improvement in school curricula. But sometimes it seems to me that the word knowledge is confusingly interpreted in the framework and in an inspector's mind to mean purely factual knowledge. And actually it's understanding that is what you need for life. And the example I was talking about this week with a school was, it's all very well and good being able to name all the rainforests, which is factual information, but actually what really matters in geography is understanding why they're there and not somewhere else, because then you can cope with the new information. So we've got hung up on that sort of grad grindish fact, to give you a northern reference, factual gathering together, but and actually what you need is the understanding to equip you for life.
And the understanding is not very well emphasized, is it? The word understanding doesn't appear that often.
No,
in any.
It used to though, didn't it? Knowledge, skills, and understanding was the first bit of that curriculum section.
No understanding can do. That was my grounding. What do children know? What do they understand? And what can they do?
Which is better.
Yes. And they were harping back to the glory days, but were they?
I don't think they were glory days. I just think you said before about an ideology or ideologies creeping in through Ofsted and schools. And I say to schools, but you should fight that, or you should do something different. And I look at them and they say, oh, that's great, Stan, but when Ofsted come and then deemed a failure, and the school's deemed a failure because we've stood up for what we believe in, and we're then turned into an academy that we don't, maybe don't want to be. But those are kind of, being the brave head teacher who says we're going to do it this way is not really a place you can, especially, and I'll say this having taught in difficult schools, in disadvantaged areas. You don't have the luxury in a disadvantaged area of making your case.
Yeah, I mean, I think you referenced glory days there, Frank. I don't think there were glory days. I think we'd all agree with that.
Yeah.
Some of the inspection frameworks have been more successful than others, and also, from my work, it's very clear to me that inspections have to change over time. Otherwise schools just become stagnant,
Yeah.
because they learn how to do the framework, don't they?
Yeah.
So, we actually need to change inspection in order to keep refreshing the system. But it's just how you do it.
Can I ask? I mean, I'll ask this question of both of you, and then we'll finish. But is inspection a necessary evil for the maintenance or improvement of school standards in this country? Adrian, let me go to Stan first.
I think there has to be some kind of regular, whatever the word is, check, because I don't think, I still believe that early inspections made a significant difference to what was going on in schools. I really think the introduction of the inspection frameworks, etc., made a difference. I'm not sure that they are currently making that difference. I think at the moment they are shifting people's thinking from one area of inspection to another. So it's all curriculum at the moment. A few years ago, it was all safeguarding. And I don't think that's the way to go. I think we need some long-term view. And I also think inspectors have to work with schools, and schools have to be responsible for their own evaluation first, and for that to be assessed by inspectors. How well do I know my school is something I think that should be at the start of inspection.
I didn't force him to say that, Adrian. I didn't honestly. But Adrian, what do you think?
Well, I agree with a lot of that, because I think one of the things we've got to get out of is having these sudden revolutionary changes.
Yeah.
And although I agree with a lot of the new framework in what it's trying to do, it is such a big change that creates a problem. So we need to work out how to evolve rather than have a revolution, because I do believe that inspection is necessary. And one of the last things I did when I was at Ofsted was we did a report on what head teachers say about inspection, and pretty well all of them said that inspection led to them making some worthwhile changes in their school. But also many of them said that the possibility of being inspected led to them making changes in their school and actually helped them to make change. And quite a few of them said, well, to be honest, if I want the staff to do something I know they're not going to like, I tell them that Ofsted are going to want it. And one person who was a senior member of a trade union, I won't say who it was, who said to me, well, to be honest, if Ofsted didn't exist, we might need to invent it. Just the possibility of being inspected is an important driver to improve. But what we can't do is lurch from one side of the road to the other every 4 years when somebody wants to have a different framework.
The other side to that, Adrian, is that Ofsted also limits innovation, because schools won't experiment in the period where they think they're coming up to an Ofsted inspection. So you can't, in my experience as an advisor, you couldn't get schools to try and do things different when Ofsted would come in. They would say quite openly, no, we'll do that once we've had our Ofsted. And
that's the fault of a framework which is too at
the time we were trying to develop creativity, and creativity was the way we were all going for a time.
That's what caused trouble in 1920s Germany when they did the creative curriculum.
I think for me, if people don't mind, I'll finish with. I just think we inspect too often. I think that's something that we spend a lot of money on Ofsted, and I'm not entirely convinced that we're getting value from it with the regularity of inspection. But yeah, I mean, I still feel as though, even though I'm not entirely happy with this framework, I still feel there is a value and a purpose to it. And I think it was right that we've got more practitioners involved, but there runs the risk then that actually I think we must acknowledge, all three of us have inspected. It's a skill, isn't it? It's not something simply because you're a head teacher you can suddenly become an inspector. I think we've all learned that. So I think we should value the role of the inspector and the skills that the ones that do it really well. We should value their skills immensely. Well, actually, that's nearly 40 minutes, folks. It just goes by in no time at all. But I have to say, I've always found Adrian, when we worked together in Ofsted, he was always digging around, looking at stuff and coming. I think you were one of the first people to identify I think it was you, Adrian. But anyway, there was a lot of work around coastal schools and stuff like that.
I did all that.
Yeah, it was, at a time
when nobody was into trouble.
But nobody was really looking at it in that way. And Adrian was always coming to things with a very different outlook and trying to find things that were sort of under the surface that weren't obvious. And today's proved it again, the value that you offer to a discussion that we have here, Adrian. So thank you very much for being our guest. And
good fun.
Yeah, and we'd love to have you back in the future. Stressful. Yeah. How would have you got a website so people can read about your findings?
My website is called River Education Services.
Brilliant. Right. And I'll put a link to that on the end of this video as well.
And they can also buy copies of the book on inspection. It's much more interesting than it sounds.
All right. Well, it's lovely to have you. And so this is edition 85A. So next week will be edition 86. But thank you very much for joining us, Adrian. And
my pleasure.
Stan, have a good week, and see you next week.